Morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is a modern church conversation between myself and Bruce Rogers-Vaughn, who I'll introduce in a moment. Just to say, if you want to know more about modern church, please check out our website, modernchurch.org.uk. Lots of material on there around issues of progressive theology. Really delighted, Bruce, to have you with us this evening. Bruce is many things, but author of this book, Caring for Souls in a Neoliberal Age, which I found enormously helpful in all sorts of different ways, and I think is crucial to our conversations around social justice, well-being, mission, and all sorts of other things, which I know we will get to explore this evening. We've got about an hour. I will give a short introduction to Bruce, but then I will allow him to introduce himself, which is always the best thing. So Bruce is Associate Professor of the Practice of Pastoral Theology and Counselling at Vanderbilt Divinity School, which is in Nashville in the USA. So great to have probably, I think, our first US contributor for a while joining us, so that's great. And Bruce has 30 years of experience in clinical pastoral psychotherapy and in teaching and research, and is president and co-founder of the Pastoral Centre for Healing in the States, where he continues in clinical practice. At least that was the case when you wrote the biog on the back of your book, Bruce. But that may have changed, I don't know. Why don't you update us on and let people know what you want people to know about who you are, your background, your experience, and just what you're bringing to this evening's conversation.
Thanks, Alison. I really appreciate the opportunity to be on Modern Church, this interview with you. I didn't know what an honor it was until I got on the Modern Church website and started reading about the history and the background. So I'm really honored to join you here. I think your listeners would be interested to know that I grew up in a working class family in the south part of the United States, the state of Alabama. In the northeast corner is where I grew up of that state, and it's in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. So my father was a factory worker for 45 years, a member of a union, and he agreed with me that if he hadn't been in the union, I probably would not have had opportunity to go to college or go to university, as they might say in Europe. So that's an important part of my background. I am a Baptist minister. I've served as a chaplain, hospice chaplain, hospital chaplain, and as you said now, as a pastoral psychotherapist, where I continue to serve at the Pastoral Center for Healing. It's actually been 35 years now. And since the book has come out, I retired from active teaching. So I no longer hold that title. So I think they call me a visiting scholar now at the Divinity School. So that's the gist about me. I taught at the Divinity School for 23 years. So it's been a main part of my professional identity, as well as the psychotherapy.
Thank you. Yeah, things kind of get frozen in time when they're published, don't they? So you kind of you sort of look back and think, oh well, I was that now, but I was that then, but I'm not that now. It's very interesting because we had our last panel. I think it was our last panel. We were looking at the whole issue of social class, and particularly within a kind of theological context. So we may well, and obviously issues of social class are important around thinking around themes of neoliberal capitalism, what it means differently for different people in terms of where you're structured in power systems. Maybe return to that. But to start with, it would just be, your book is Caring for Souls in a Neoliberal Age, and it is very much an overview of, amongst other things, what neoliberalism is, or neoliberal capitalism. So I think as a starting point, it would be really helpful to hear from you. Just give us that overview so we're all kind of starting at the same place in this conversation. What is neoliberal capitalism, and what does that phrase mean? And yeah, how do we start this conversation about it? What's the kind of recent history? What are the important characteristics of it that we need to be paying attention to?
Well, to start with, I should say neoliberalism is really a horrible term, right? It's very confusing. Um, so right out of the hatch, I should say that the word liberal and neoliberal does not refer to anything political or philosophical or much less theological. So we're not talking about progressivism, for example. Um, the term actually derives from classical economics in the 19th century. So the root, as you know, of the word liberal, as in liberation, has to do with freedom. But in the word neoliberalism, liberalism does not refer to the freedom of persons. It refers to the freedom of markets. So that's the critical thing to know. So literally, the etymology of the word neoliberalism means a new way to free capital markets is what it's referring to. And it's interesting, Allison, when we use the term like neoliberal global capitalism, you'll often see those words strung together, but it's actually a trinity of redundancies because neoliberalism is by its nature global, and it is, of course, a phase of capitalism. The ideas for neoliberalism actually began to emerge in the 1920s and 30s in Britain, on the European continent, and in the United States. And it arose, the ideas began to arise because wealthy men, and I am talking men, these were all North American, European white men, were concerned about how to hold on to power during a time, as you recall in history, when the old colonial system was beginning to break up. So there were liberation movements all around the world, as well as worker movements. And there was alarm and panic. How are we going to hold on to this power? And the answer to that was they came up with the idea of, well, we could hold on to control of the world instead of using military occupation and annexing territories. We could use a global financial system to control the world. It was a brilliant idea, and eventually it worked. But these were very marginal and fringe ideas, actually, until around 1980, when Thatcher was elected as prime minister in Britain and Ronald Reagan was elected president of the United States. This is when these ideas moved from the margin to the center in terms of politics and economics. So they decided that they could use this world financial system, a global banking system, if you will, actually to impose debt. So you could control a country in Africa or South America or literally anywhere in the world, but typically this was imposed on former colonies. And if you could keep them in debt, you could still control them because they wouldn't have the freedom to make their own decisions or exercise their own sovereignty. This is what Michael Hudson has called finance as warfare. You can do the same thing by banking that you formerly would have done by the military. So we really should think of neoliberalism as today's version of colonialism. This is what colonialism looks like today. It's what imperialism looks like today. So after the 80s, this neoliberalism really came into power and became dominant in the 1990s. So this was when Bill Clinton was president in the United States, and they had what was called the Washington Consensus. And this was while Tony Blair was prime minister in England. And I forget the term the Blair administration used to call, they had a terminology as well for this. A few more things that I would say about it before we move forward that are important to know is if you look at neoliberalism as an economic, just through the economics lens, it really has three components. There's a book by Kean Birch called A Research Agenda for Neoliberalism, where he spells this out. The three components are, first of all, the antitrust laws are repealed and global monopolies emerge. And the irony of this is we usually think people who advocate neoliberal agendas talk about free markets. Well, under neoliberalism, markets are actually not free because large global monopolies are in control of the economy. The second thing that's part of this is the economy moves from entrepreneurship to rentiership. So we still today hear a lot of talk about entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship. But the real actor in charge in neoliberalism is the rentier, or if we want to stick with the proper French, rentier. So what is a rentier? A rentier is someone who lives by unearned income. So they rent out things that they control. And this can include not just commodities, but things like knowledge and healthcare and services, and charge for these. So that's the key actor in the neoliberal phase of capitalism, is the rentier. And finally, all of this is held together from the top down. It's very hierarchical. It's held together from the top down by a very sophisticated system of law and contract law. So, every time you may recall, if you need to update your operating system on your phone, you have to sign an agreement. Nobody reads these, but you sign an agreement, and we're signing away, many of our rights and controls to large corporations just in our everyday lives. And the final thing I would say about it before we move on to how this impacts us is neoliberalism has a core strategy to make all of this work, to bring all this into place. And the core strategy of it, as Noam Chomsky has articulated very well, is that it dismantles really all forms of human association. So human collectives, everything from unions to civic organizations, religious organizations and churches, human association is dismantled. And why is that important? Well, Marx talked about this during the Paris Revolution, when he said that those controlling Paris had turned society into a sack of potatoes. In other words, everybody was disassociated from each other so that those in power could control, and there was no opportunity for resistance or democratic participation. So that's where we sit these days.
That's absolutely fascinating, because I mean, what you're highlighting really is that it was a deliberate. I think we tend to think of neoliberal capitalism as kind of like the weather. It's just something that happened, and that is happened. It just sort of emerged. But what you're describing is something that was deliberately designed for a particular purpose, and that particular purpose was the retention of power, and the power was in a way to replace power that was being lost. So it sounds almost like it's a new form of slavery, and the economics being at the heart of it, and debt being at the heart of it, and as you're saying, and the law comes in to defend that, and politics, but it's politically driven. That would not have happened had there not been this sort of, whatever caused that alliance, we would have time to go into, between Reagan and Thatcher, and their own particular journeys to that. And I'm
Could
sure.
I interrupt you briefly,
Yeah,
Al?
sure, do.
Yeah, I just wanted to not let it get by me. You put your finger on something very important, and that is how this becomes normalized. So you're sitting there in the UK, so Margaret Thatcher is on my mind. Margaret Thatcher said, you may remember her aphoristic acronym, TINA, there is no alternative. And she said it very well. So by the 1990s, this was certainly the case. No one thought of there being any other alternative, but this is the way things are.
There is no alternative, and there's no such thing as society, being the other aphorism, which aligns with what you're saying about the obliteration, or the attempted obliteration, of any form of association. Because we can there's so many things that I want to explore all at once, but I think what's unique about your approach is the fact that you're bringing a therapist's insights, and you've watched what's happened to individuals who've come to you over the last 35 years or more. And you, in the book, you describe how that's changed in a very, it's a very powerful way that you're showing what's happening in terms of what people are bringing, and also how people are changing in the sense over generations. I wonder if you could just say a bit about that, because I think it's the kind of thing that's very hard to grasp for any one of us in any particular point in time. It's only when you look at a trajectory that you can get more sense of what's changing, what's happening. And I feel that you have that trajectory within your lifetime, and from your perspective, and with the critique that you're bringing, because you're thinking, this isn't okay. It isn't okay. You're not just observing it as something that's interesting. You're observing it with someone with a critique saying, and this is not okay. So can you sort of introduce us to some of those ideas and some of those changes that you've observed?
Yes, let me cut right to it. Well, I'll first say something off the cuff, that 35 years ago, when people were coming into my office, it was not uncommon for someone to say, I'm here because a certain thing has happened to me and it is troubling me. So they would point to things outside themselves that had had an effect on them, had impacted their lives. This is unusual now for people to do this when they first come into my office. What they're most likely to say now is various versions of something is wrong with me. And they point to themselves as the problem and the thing that needs to be changed, instead of something outside of themselves impacting them. You stop to think about that. That is a humongous change with many implications. But to get to point here, I would say that for me, as a minister and as a psychotherapist, what has happened as a result of neoliberalism is that it's increased suffering worldwide. And it's not only increased suffering, it's actually altered how we suffer, which I will get to in a few moments. Well, how has it done this? I think of this as kind of a double action, a pincher effect, if you will. And part of that double action is that this increase in suffering is due to increases in economic inequality. Capitalism itself, even before the neoliberal phase, but now much more dramatically in the neoliberal phase, produces economic inequality. And people who theorized neoliberalism thought this was a good thing. Inequality would help incentivize people to work and to be more creative and so forth. And it has done this fantastically well. According to Oxfam International, here in the United States, 3 men are holding as much wealth as the bottom half of the population of the country. And if we talk about this globally, 15 men, and they're all men, are holding as much wealth as the lower half of the population of the planet. And I haven't checked the population lately, but that's got to be 2-3 billion people or so. I mean, certainly hundreds of millions. This is just numbingly outrageous. And Wilson and Pickett, who are epidemiologists there in the UK, actually wrote a book back in 2008 you may have seen, called The Spirit Level. And they looked at the 21 wealthiest countries on the planet in terms of GDP. And they asked the question, to what degree does economic inequality impact social well-being? And they found that no matter how wealthy the country was, the higher the inequality, the greater the distance between the haves and the have-nots, the more social well-being deteriorated. And this includes the area of my concern and work, which is mental illness and addictions and so forth, psychological distress in all of its forms. We could quote, statistics forever here, but you go on the internet and do a simple search, and you'll see that the rates of depression, of anxiety, addictions of all kinds have soared basically globally. And here in the United States, just to choose one data point, according to the Center for Disease Control, the suicide rates have increased 36% just between 2000 and 2018, just before COVID hit. Dipped slightly when COVID hit, and then it went back up again and is still increasing. So I think the key here to how economic inequality affects us psychologically and even relationally, because it's also deteriorated families, partnerships, and relationships. The key here is material precarity, which just does so many devastating things to people. And that is paired with a growing sense of failure. Not only am I failing to thrive economically, but it's my fault, is what is happening to people under neoliberalism. So I mentioned the two-pincher act. The other side of it that I think is affecting suffering is the culture of neoliberalism. This is something that is not, it's really under-theorized. There are some people getting on board with it. But what do I mean by culture? Culture is what we think of as normal. It includes what we think of what it means to be a human being. And it has an ethical component. What does it mean to be a good human being as opposed to an unworthy or bad human being? Throwing another Thatcherism in here. In an interview with, I think it was the Sunday Times in 1981, you'll remember this. She said, economics are the method. The object is to change the heart and soul. Now, for Thatcher, she smiled when she said that. This was a good thing. To me, it is bone chilling to say that economics are the method and the object is to change the heart and soul. And unfortunately, it's been very successful doing this. And the sources of culturally of how neoliberalism has increased suffering is one, I've already mentioned the dismantling of human collectives. When you think about that, this leads to isolation and loneliness. So the first part of increase of suffering is simply the isolation of people. It's not for no reason, for example, that the Geneva Conventions considered solitary confinement to be an inhumane form of treatment. And we might think of neoliberal culture as putting us all in little boxes in our own little solitary confinements. A bit of an exaggeration, perhaps, but not much. It's very similar to that. A second thing that neoliberal culture does, I'm going to name 4. I could name 20, but these are the top 4 in my view. The second thing it does is many people have said it turns us into entrepreneurs of the self. Wendy Brown, a critical theorist here in the US, has said that we all have become our own little capitals. I had a client about 5 years ago who came to the session. He knew nothing about my research. He said he had just passed a middle school playground in which 2 little boys were getting into a fist fight. So middle school here is around 12 or 13 years old. And one boy was yelling at the other, "You are stealing my brand." So think of that even children, and maybe especially children who have been born since long after the 80s, since the neoliberal revolution, I would call it, are thinking of themselves as individual brands. And we all tend to do this. Think of how we use social media, for example, and set up our profiles and operate in this way. Coupled with this, a third thing I would mention is the emphasis on individual responsibility and meritocracy. As you said, Thatcher said, there's no such thing as society, only individuals, she said. Well, if they're only individuals, who's responsible when things go well? Well, you are. You get to take the credit. But for most of us, because of growing inequality and lack of resources and so forth, for most of us, this means we don't succeed. We are not thriving. And when we have a philosophy of individual meritocracy, we can only blame ourselves when things go poorly. So we've become very much a shame-based culture under neoliberal governance. And the last thing I would mention, and one of my favorite, is an emphasis on affect management. So we all are expected to manage our own affects, believe it or not. So neoliberalism values what some researchers call high arousal positive, HAP, high arousal positive affects. So excitement, flourishing, optimism, always overcoming obstacles, et cetera, et cetera. And what this means is if you are not happy, if you're not optimistic, if you happen to be sad, or like me, you're a melancholic personality, then you're not a good person. It's something bad. So it's really remarkable. So the last thing I'll mention about how it's impacting suffering, I want to come back to the how, if it's okay, Allison, unless you have a follow-up to anything I just said.
I just have so many things that I want to follow up on. But before you come back to the how, I just wanted to say that if people are watching this on the live feed and you have something that you want to ask, then you are free to use the chat, and whatever your comment or question is, it should make its way to me by various means. But yeah, Bruce, go ahead with the how.
Yes. So remarkably, as I studied this more and more, and also observed in my clinical practice, it's not just changing, an increasing number of people suffering and increasing suffering worldwide in terms of the volume. It's transforming suffering. It's changing how we suffer. I call this in the book third order suffering. Other people have called it the new chronic, or other terminologies. What do I mean by third order? Well, I made this up, obviously, but first order suffering, in my mind, is existential. As theologians, we know that suffering is baked in the cake of being a human being. We're born, we die, we are subject to disease and to various kinds of limitations that cause us pain and suffering. These cannot be avoided. Second order suffering, as I have stated it in the book, is the suffering that human beings impose upon each other. So it's what we do to each other that cause suffering. So various kinds of injustices, all the way from interpersonal slights in interpersonal relationships, all the way to the national stage, war, and in between, social injustices like sexism and racism and et cetera. All of this is second order suffering, which is horrible enough, right? Third order suffering is something innovative. It's not new. I mean, Bruce Alexander, a psychologist in Vancouver in Canada, wrote a book called The Globalization of Addiction. And he noted that this kind of suffering I'm talking about, he didn't call it third order suffering, but he said the kind of suffering I'm talking about, he called it psychosocial dislocation. It's occurred in various periods of history, but only as a transition. So when one civilization collapsed and another was beginning, for example, or when a whole people was displaced and then a new kind of society replaces it, it sort of occurs in the gaps. What's different in neoliberalism is that it becomes normative. So third order suffering increases not just when capitalism fails, but precisely when it's doing its thing. So the better it gets at doing it, the more third order suffering we have. So what am I talking about? It arises from three features, one of which I've touched on already, but I'll put it slightly differently. The weakening of institutions. So traditional institutions, as we might call them, this includes certain kinds of government, it includes labor unions, it includes basically, certainly religions and religious institutions are included. So it weakens these institutions, and I've talked about this, which leads to a lack of belonging, where you're going to suffer differently when you're not plugged into a community than you do when you're embedded in a community. The second thing that combines with this, so these three things work in tandem. when you think about it, when you lose institutions, you also lose a symbolic system or a system of narratives that help give meaning to our suffering. That goes along with it once you start dismantling institutions. And the third thing that occurs as a result of the first two is the fragmentation of the self. So increasingly, we have people who don't have much of a sense of self, which is worse than having bad self-esteem. It's having no experience of coherence or very little sense of coherence over time. So we lose a sense of having continuity in our lives. Extremely distressing to people. And I could go into clinical detail on that, but I'll withhold. I just want to label those. And finally, I want to mention that what is characteristic of third order suffering that is different from the first two is what I call double unconsciousness. So we have the irony, the paradox here of people who are suffering who are not aware of their suffering. Soren Kierkegaard actually wrote about this when he wrote Sickness Unto Death, and that was what, 17th century, early 18th perhaps. I'm missing my dates in my head. But he talked about despair that is not aware of itself as being despair. And he said that was the deepest layer of despair. So today we have people who are suffering who are not aware of their suffering. We're having people suicide out of thin air, apparently, with no obvious prior mental health problems. The other kind of unconsciousness is we have people who know they're suffering, but they can't pin it on anything. So, like I said at the beginning of the interview, they can't point to some external thing that's causing their suffering. They're not aware of how the dots connect to cause their suffering. So I think I say in the book that what we have left is a kind of zombie suffering. We're all walking around and falling apart, but we don't know why. So it's a
something, Bruce, about how those three interrelate, because as you were talking, it occurred to me that in neoliberalism, first order suffering, it's almost as though we want to, unlike our religious traditions, we want to say they're not self-evident. Actually, life and death don't have to be, there's this guy who's trying to keep himself alive forever, right, somewhere in the States, and eating all sorts of weird stuff. And so it's like, and over, the assisted dying debate about, we want to be in control of when we die and how we die, which in a sense is flying in the face of the so-called obviousness of first order suffering, life, death. Second order suffering has become totally individualized, so that, we're encouraged to not see ourselves as part of oppressed groups within neoliberalism, because, as you say, if we fail, it's our own individual fault. It's not because we're structurally oppressed, because supposedly everybody's got the same opportunities to succeed. And as you said, if you don't succeed, it's your own individual fault. So those two things, it seems to me, are interacting with the third order suffering. But I'm also wondering whether, and this is taking us on to the conversation about resistance, paradoxically, if you're part of an oppressed group, does that not give you a sense of identity, which you can turn against the neoliberal system? Because by definition, as being an LGBT person, for instance, you have a reference group of people who share an understanding and an identity. And similarly for, different theological traditions that have arisen from that: liberation theology, Black theology, queer theology, feminist theology. You've alluded to the gender question. In what way can those actually be part of the resistance? Because it gives you a grouping to speak from.
Oh, very good. I love the way you just put your finger right on it. Let me speak to the first part of what you said, and then maybe that will move us into some ideas about resistance, which I think we should talk about before we end today. The word I like to use in the book about the relationship between these three kinds of suffering is that they are entangled. So third order suffering does not replace first order and second order. It just gets tangled up with them and changes what they look like. So, for example, as you were just saying, with second order suffering, racism is now either altogether denied. There are many in the United States, as you might know, looking at our horrible politics right now. There are many in the United States who are saying, well, we've moved past racism. That's a thing of the past. This doesn't exist anymore. And on the other hand, third order suffering wants to individualize it, as you said. So racism is just a few bad apples. There's no such thing as systemic or structural or socialized forms of racism. It's just a few bad apples that need to be. So in the United States, we're giving all these kinds of DEI workshops and so forth to try to do diversity training. And supposedly, if we just change the hearts of some individual white people, racism will go away. Well, this is not working. It's just not working. The only thing that's working, I think, is it alleviates the guilt of some liberal white people. But beyond that, it's not helping any people of color. So, so you might say third order suffering is sort of cloaking or invisibilizing second order suffering, as well as the first order suffering. It's trying to obliviate suffering altogether as if it could be cured or made a thing of the past. So I wanted to talk about that before we move directly into resistance, because I think that very thing is also the same thing that gives us some possibilities of resistance. But you may want to comment on that, Allison, before we jump right into that.
Well, I want to jump into resistance because I think because of what I know about the ways in which you construct the possibilities of resistance, which again is one of the things I found so helpful about your book. And my question is what does resistance look like? But you've talked a lot about clearly, and that I'm coming from a perspective of involvement in community organising. So the whole place of collectives and how we use collectives is obviously really important. But I'm also wondering, I'm wondering about that. I'm also wondering about the ways in which those forms of collectives, but the way in which collectives work needs to be more intentional, and what kinds of movements of collectives are actually more effective at resistance. Because just being a part of a collective, going to, as we know, let's bring it down to church, going to church every Sunday, if that church is, it doesn't necessarily mean you're part of the resistance to neoliberalism, because you may just be participating in neoliberalism with a religious sticker on it. So what does resistance look like? What is a resistant collective, if that makes sense? And can churches be resistant collectives?
So can we bracket the church's part for a little bit and make some general comments? We are kindred souls, I think, you and I, on this. An initial comment I would make is, here in the United States, I can't speak for Britain, but here in the United States, we've become almost obsessively preoccupied with protests. I'm not criticizing the necessity for having public protests, but what I think has become problematic is these protests have become almost spectacles that become easily co-opted by neoliberal interests, ironically enough, in that they just become, clickbait to watch on the news or something, and then they pass and nothing changes. I think we have to admit, those of us who want to change society, that protests by themselves have not been very effective tools for change. It is only, what matters is when an organization of people, the organization of people into durable collectives, as you have just said, not just any collective, but collectives that strive for changes in policies and practice in society and stay really focused on what policies and practices are they trying to change, and how are they trying to change them? But another thing is leaderless movements get us nowhere. I look back on the Occupy movement with some fondness, but at the same time, it had very little lasting effect because it was trying to be, we're all anarchists. We wanted to level everything and not have any leaders. Well, when you don't have any leaders, you can't have really organized collectives that can have continuity over time. So I might say I should admire the Anglican Church for that, perhaps. But we'll come back to church. Let me mention two recent books, by the way, for your listeners that shed a lot of light on that came out just in the past few months. Frederick de Boer, Deboer, wrote a book called How Elites Ate the Social Justice Movement. I love the title, and who talks in depth about this. And also Vincent Bevins, who actually may be British. I think he's also written for publications in the US. But this book just came out a few weeks ago, I think, and the title is If We Burn, The Mass Protest Decade and the Missing Revolution. So very good resources for thinking about how are we going to organize collectives that actually could lead us toward change. A couple other things to say about it, maybe we'll get to churches in a minute, is effective resistance, I would say as a psychotherapist, effective resistance is motivated. It is impassioned. There's no resistance where there's no passion. And I think that this passion arises from shared experiences of suffering, from collective mourning, if you will. Gabriel Marcel is someone I read a lot, the French philosopher Marcel, when I was writing my dissertation, which was on hope. Marcel said, there is no hope where the temptation to despair does not exist. So he would say despair is a prerequisite for hope. It is how we deal with despair. It is how we get through despair and out of our despair. But I would add to what Marcel said that despair in isolation only fragments us. We die when we're isolated in our despair. So it's collective sorrow, I think, that feeds hope. When we come together, I think it was Miguel de Unamuno said, if we all came out of our homes and into the streets and shared our pain, we would be surprised at our lack of ingenuity. How much our suffering is in common with each other. Marcel also said that the purest form of hope was, I hope in thee for us. And thee was capitalized, meaning whatever we consider infinite and transcendent. So this is what I would call deep solidarity, is when we're able to, I hope in thee for us, when there's a collective pouring out of our sorrows that also strengthens our hope in the very sharing of our sorrows. So this means, I should add, that resistance looks a lot like love. Or if love is a word that has too much baggage for you, care is a good word here. William Davies, I think he's still on the faculty at Goldsmiths in London. Davies says that in a review he wrote somewhere that neoliberal logic, quote, gets stuck when it comes to love. It has no explanation for how love can actually even exist, because we're all supposed to simply be self-interested individuals. So love is, a facade, according to that logic. But I would say, contrary to neoliberal beliefs, it tries to sort of shapeshift love to make it a matter of personal choice and personal initiative and positive feelings and so on. But love, as theologians, we should know that love is not limited to personal, intimate relationships. These are probably not even the highest forms of what we would call love theologically. Nor is love a personal choice. Instead, I think we discover love is an obligation that is already there between us and other people when we have this shared experience of pouring out of our sorrows and our pain. There's a Jesuit theologian named Robert Johann who has contended that authentic love is disinterested. And I want to quote him because it's such a, he wrote this book in the 60s, but it's such a nice response to neoliberalism. I'm going to read it if you don't mind. He said, when love is interested, when attraction is based on a motive of profit or need, it has no difficulty in finding words to justify itself. But, he continues, there is a love that cannot explain itself. Why do I love you? Because you are you. That is the best it can do. It is indefensible. So I think this kind of love he's talking about is inexplicable by the logic of neoliberalism. It just can't exist. So wherever it does exist, it is already an act of resistance or rebellion even against the neoliberal status quo. So I wrote in an essay that's been published in a chapter of a book that, and I'm quoting myself here, one way I wrote to oppose present day colonization is to cultivate relationships that are, according to the logic of neoliberalism, absolutely useless.
I love it. I love that because I don't know, it points to this possibility that we can connect with and listen to and express this collective sense of sadness or suffering, and therefore through that maybe even joy and hope, and positive things, in a way that is not expected or structured by any kind of, I mean, it's a kind of serendipitous thing, isn't it? But if we don't put ourselves in the way of, if we don't find ways of setting up situations where that can happen, then it won't happen. Or if situations arise where it looks like it's going to happen, and we had that in the pandemic, people went out and clapped for the NHS and they connected with each other with physical distance in ways they hadn't done before. They offered disinterested love to support people, but we didn't find a way of capturing that for anything more long term. And it feels like it's a conundrum about, and would it be a surprise if any way that we did find was then deliberately destroyed by the powers of neoliberalism? So I was just going to say to you, and that those things you're talking about, if we do find ways of making useless connections because that's a positive resistance, we can expect that to be punished surely by the neoliberal system. And what kind of punishment do you see?
Absolutely. I get quickly into the weeds here, but Noam Chomsky has been a very outspoken public intellectual here in the US on this very issue. I watched an interview of him recently where he was recalling the history of liberation theology in Latin America. And I forget which country it was. I think actually there were multiple countries where something like this occurred. Liberation theology was gaining hold and doing exactly what you and I are talking about, creating solidarity with people, the grassroots and resistance. And the United States, through the CIA and other military activity, actually assassinated some of the leaders of the liberation movements in South America. So that's a frightening fact and a reminder that US imperialism is real and is a component of what we're talking about. It's wed to neoliberalism. But yeah, I mean, there certainly can be less dramatic and less fatal forms of the way neoliberal powers can just come in and interrupt something that is getting traction. If my book were to gain traction, you can expect somebody to be putting slurs out there in social media about me, or
I mean, this
making
is not
I did.
the same issue, but I'm thinking of linguistic ways in which, so the famous thing about woke and wokery is a way of getting back at people who, as was political correctness before that. So as soon as you bring a power analysis or a structural analysis to suffering, the punishment is, and that may sound kind of not that important or sort of incidental, but actually what it stands for is that process whereby the punishment and the happens, and it stands for something much more serious, which is, and actually what you're saying about leadership as well, because the point about leaderless movements, but then also if the leader full movements and the leadership can be easily picked off, that's another way of undoing the resistance, isn't it? So how we promote leadership, which is diverse, and community organising has leadership, the unlikely leaders and the development of unlikely leaders all the time as part of the methodology. And I think that's really important, because it means the leadership is dispersed, so that you can't just pick off one or two people and destroy a movement. So it's, you can kind of see how all the bits fit together. But sorry, I'm taking over. What you're going to say something?
No, I will add something to what you just said. Considering what I call third order suffering manifests as double unconsciousness, woke is actually a very nice term. So without always using the word woke, I'm always talking to students and people in churches when I give talks that the first step to resistance is waking up. It's coming out of our slumber, becoming aware, seeing things we did not see before, feeling things we did not feel before, which is being woke. I mean, that's what being woke means to me. But yes, it's become, a term that's used as sort of a slur to get back at people who are working for change. And I understand that, some forms of identity politics. I've mentioned in the book, there are forms of identity politics that are thoroughly neoliberal, because they focus only on individual identities and not these collective movements of solidarity that you and I are talking about. Yeah. I'll stop and let you read a rest. I could get into the weeds here.
No, I've got my eye on the time, because believe it or not, we have about 8 minutes left. And I did want us to talk about churches and whether they can be part of the resistance or part of the system, and what kind of pointers you would offer us in our critique of or our understanding of ways in which we are all, colluding with neoliberalism by definition, because it's the sea that we swim in, and that includes in our spiritual lives. You talk about the difference between individual spirit and soul, so I don't know whether that's a place to start rather than talking about institutions of churches, but it's a huge area to cover in 8 minutes, I realise. But some pointers that you might have, Bruce, would be helpful.
Yeah, I think I say a lot about soul in the book. It's just a word that's underappreciated, and I'm fear is getting lost in some of our theologizing these days. It needs some recovery and some specificity. But I think I need to skip over it somewhat to get to your question about churches, because my answer to whether churches can be important to resistance is it depends. So it depends on whether they embody soul. And loosely, I'd call soul a fabric that connects us to ourselves, to others, to society, to the earth, and to the eternal. So it's this web of connection that is paradoxically also only realized in an appreciation of true individuality. There's a great difference between individualism and individuality. Individualism, we've already talked about, isolates people. Individuality, Jesus regarded as extremely precious. You recall the saying of Jesus in the Gospels that you're so precious to God that every hair on your head is numbered. You can't get more precious than that. But soul is this fabric that connects us all in our unique individuality and is expressed through the individuality. It's not instead of individuality. So if churches embody soul, they absolutely can reclaim, and let me use the word reclaim, their position as sites of resistance. My aspirational answer to the question is there are not very many collectives left in our societies other than churches to do this work. Now, I'm not saying it's only churches. Unions have been weakened, but they're not out of existence. There are other forms of active works. I'm not saying it's exclusively church, but think about how many churches there are that are still sites where people collect. But if we embodied soul, I think then we do become, as churches, not isolated, but churches banding together, then can form a very large movement, as they sometimes have in the past. During the abolitionist movement in the United States, during the civil rights movement in the United States. You can no doubt think of examples in Britain, where in periods of history where this happened. It's much harder today because of this atomization of society that neoliberalism has done. It's hard for our efforts to organize and form solidarity to happen. But I still think it's possible. I still think that is possible. I've just started reading a book, so don't hold me as an expert on this book yet, but I'm going to throw it out there. It just came out a few weeks ago. The book is by, let me find it in my note, Sheldon Stromquist, and the book is Claiming the City, A Global History of Workers' Fight for Municipal Socialism. It's a big title, but he looks at a period of history in the late 19th century and the early 20th. And he looks at the United States, Britain, New Zealand, and Australia, and a few other sites where municipal movements, not national movements. So today, I think, and he kind of says we make the mistake today of thinking that resistance and change has to happen at the ballot box. It can only happen by changing the national government, things at the national level. And he says this wasn't true during this very fertile period of history when there were great movements of solidarity happening worldwide. They tended to be municipal movements. Well, when you think about that, churches can play a critical role. And he actually said this, that churches did play a critical role in these municipal movements that didn't just try to liberalize our politics or, change the taxation structure. It actually opened up additional public spaces for public health, for education, for food services, and so on. This absolutely could happen again. I think of two ways, and then I'll stop and let you add or close, whichever we need to do. As you know, the scene of religion is changing worldwide, maybe especially in the US, Europe, and Britain. There's a decline of religious participation in churches, for example. So I think two things could happen, though. One is we probably need to appreciate that there are non-traditional ways of churches emerging. So I think of gatherings of believers that are happening in homes, in schools, in the workplace, just like they did in some of the socialist movements. There was a Christian socialism movement in the US in the 19th century that was largely outside the church. This could gain hold again, I think. A second way, I think, is what are we going to do with all these church buildings? All these properties that we can no longer pay the utility bills for because our membership's declining. I really would appeal to churches to open themselves up as public spaces, share the facilities and their resources of buildings with municipal movements, with local movements. So Stromquist talks about translocal movements. So he said back then, these movements happened locally, but they were aware of other local movements in the world that they could connect to. And I think there are some clues there for how we could get started again. I hope that's helpful in a general way, at least.
I think that's really helpful in many different ways, but I think the distinction I'm hearing is between, so in organizing we talk about organizing people and money for power, which is the ability to act. And I think when churches are connecting in with what you're calling municipal movements, but what we might call in our current context third sector, civic society, participatory democracy, and it is primarily local, where those relationships between individual churches and alliances of third sector organizations that want to come together to organize people and power for specific aims and objectives to make change. That's a very effective way of churches being engaged. And then, of course, what they discover is, just left to their own devices, they try and say, here's a building, community, here's a building, please use it. But there's nothing, they're not connecting with anything. So surprise, surprise, nobody comes forward to use the building. But that connection gives you access to other institutions, for want of a better word, collectives that may say, oh, what we really need is your resource. We need your building for this, or we need your building for that. So suddenly you do have, through those connections,
you raise a good point. Churches first have to be in relationship with these movements emerging around them. And a last word I would say on this, Allison, and this is an appeal from my Baptist heart. I memorized a lot of scripture growing up Baptist. And I think we have forgotten in the churches, we have civilized the gospel and tamed it. If you read the gospels with fresh eyes, it is so radical. It is so radical. And my mind goes, as we're talking about how could this happen among churches, to the parable of the mustard seed, about how change happens. If you look at one little locality, it doesn't seem to be very important. But as these localities connect to each other and spread, or a little leaven that leavens the whole loaf, was another saying of Jesus. So, Jesus was crucified because he was a threat. I don't agree with the theology that he was crucified because he had to pay a debt for our sin. That's not my theology. So, pardon me dropping a bomb at the end of the interview, but
you don't surprise me that you're not into substitutionary or whatever theories of the atonement. So yeah, and that was my last question, wasn't it? Which you got to before I did, about biblical touchstones. So thank you so much for that. Gosh, it's been a fantastic hour, Bruce. Thank you so much for everything that you've offered, and actually introducing us to things that are ultimately hopeful. And I've said this is why I value the book so much, because it doesn't just critique the system as it is and make you feel hopeless at the end of it. You finish the book and you think, wow, there are some definite things that we can do as a result of this. And I hope that people who listen to this, who are from religious, spiritual communities and churches, get a sense that there is definitely a lot to do.
Can I conclude by saying, please have me back again?
We would love to have you back again, because I didn't get to ask you the question about what you're currently working on and what you're passionate about.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to talk to you about monetary reform and how churches should be involved in changing the money system, because if we could just change the money system, we could change most of the stuff we're talking about. So, and Jesus had a lot of interest in money.
That's our agenda for Bruce Rogers-Vaughn Conversation Mark II.
Exactly. Thank you. I've enjoyed this a lot, Allison. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Goodbye. Thanks everybody for listening in.